Well, it is a U-turn, isn't
Another
it?
one.
Yeah, it is another U-turn. You can't really see it any
Another
other
Keir
way,
Starmer U-turn. We've had U-turn on winter fuel. We've had U-turn coming up, of course, on the two-benefit child cap. Pretty sure that's coming up because there's going to be a critical vote on benefits soon. And now grooming gangs. Humiliating for Yvette Cooper too, the Home Secretary, who has to face the music today because the Prime Minister's in G7 with his old mate Mark Carney, the former Governor of the Bank of England, as the new Prime Minister.
I'm not sure what this inquiry will achieve, but it is a U-turn, and that is embarrassing or humiliating. But if you say no, and then you appoint Louise Casey, who's a troubleshooter, probably the most powerful woman in Whitehall. Worked for both governments, takes a deep dive very quickly into a problem and says you have to do this.
She's crossbench, isn't she?
But the moment she says you need an inquiry, you've got to have an inquiry.
Why was he so reluctant?
Well, I think because he'd lived through the Alexis J inquiry into sexual abuse, which included grooming gangs. He changed the law when he changed how the prosecutors operated, as Andrew Norfolk, the Times journalist, who did much to expose what happened in Rotherham, acknowledged. Yeah. He changed how it works. So he started the prosecution of the grooming gangs. But of course, it came back as a big national issue in January because of Elon Musk.
Yeah. Who tweeted about it?
Who was ignorant of what had happened in terms of inquiries. He falsely accused Starmer of being complicit with the gangs, which Andrew Norfolk, the journalist who exposed Rotherham, said is just not true, because he dealt with them at the time. Yeah. He also attacked Jess Phillips, a safeguarding minister, in the most grotesque ways. And then you have the Conservatives jumping on the bandwagon because they didn't have their inquiry over 14 years. Yeah. And then you had the main victims groups didn't call for another national inquiry because we'd had the Alexis J inquiry, which included grooming gangs. It was all sexual
and they wanted those recommendations implemented in full.
And the Conservatives didn't implement the findings.
OK, so you've just argued, Kevin, that an inquiry is not necessary.
Well, I'll tell you what could achieve.
But they've just announced one.
Kevin says, I'm not sure what it achieved. It might actually hold to account some of the people who turned a blind eye.
Yes.
Who did not investigate, who decided, from what Casey's report is going to say, we can't get involved in all of this because of racial sensitivities, because her report is going to say the majority of the grooming gangs were men of Pakistani origin. She's saying that emphatically in her report. So that's why...
Wait, I'm going to interrupt you both.
The report could actually mean some of the people should be held responsible.
I'm going to interrupt you both because...
Most grooming gang members are white.
No, that's what she's going to say in her report.
Yeah. Let's talk to the Shadow Home Secretary, Chris Philp, who joins us now. Very good morning to you. Tell us why you think this inquiry is necessary, because as we've already heard, a number of people, including those involved, including the police whistleblower Maggie Oliver, said they're not sure that this is anything more than a PR exercise, that there were recommendations made by Alexis J, not fully implemented, including under your government. Why do we need a new national inquiry?
Good morning. Well, all the victims and survivors that I've spoken to do think we need a proper inquiry. And the reason for that is that over many, many years, people in positions of authority in the police, in local authorities and in the Crown Prosecution Service deliberately covered up these appalling crimes against very young girls, some as young as just 10 years old, because the perpetrators were mainly of Pakistani origin. And these police officers and the local authorities were more interested in so-called harmonious race relations and not upsetting the Pakistani community in these towns. They were more interested in that than in safeguarding and protecting these young girls. That is absolutely disgraceful. It's disgusting, frankly. And not a single person, not one, has been in authority, has been held to account for deliberately. It wasn't accidental. They deliberately covered it up. And there's a criminal offence called misconduct in public office, which I think these people are guilty of, and they should frankly be investigated and prosecuted. And that is why we need a proper statutory inquiry. We've been calling for it for some time now, for some months now. When we first called for it, back in, I think, January, Keir Starmer branded me and other people like me, other campaigners, he branded us as jumping on a far right bandwagon, is what he said. And now here we are 6 months later, where his own report by Baroness Casey says that, in fact, this inquiry is now needed.
You quite rightly say that you called for this inquiry some months ago, but isn't that coming rather late to the party? I mean, you guys were in power for over 14 years. You did nothing about this. I'll just put the question to you that if you can quite correctly accuse the police of getting it wrong in terms of worrying about being accused of racism, when there was nothing racist about taking action against these horrible men at all. It was a straight matter of criminality. That same timidity we can see in the political process, can't we? We can see it in the final decision by the current government to say yes to the inquiry, but you never said yes to an inquiry. You were just as nervous as the police were about being accused of racism.
Well, that isn't entirely true, although I would say the last government, I think, could have commissioned this inquiry, but the last government did do quite a lot. I mean, in some cases, before I was even in Parliament. I mean, for example, the original inquiry into Rotherham was commissioned in 2014 by Theresa May as Home Secretary. There was a report commissioned by Sajid Javid when he was Home Secretary in about 2017 or 18 into the ethnicity of perpetrators, and Rishi Sunak, when he was Prime Minister, set up the Grooming Gangs Task Force to go after these despicable people, which led to 550 arrests in the first year. So the last government, did take and they also set up the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, which took 7 years, and it touched on this issue, but it was mainly about other forms of sexual abuse. So the last government did all of those things, but what happened last year, I think it was in July, Oldham Council contacted the new government, the newly elected government, saying we need a proper national inquiry into this. We, Oldham Council, can't do it on our own. And the Labour government, contemptuously dismissed that request, and then that led to, when that became public in January, it then led to the sort of campaign of the last few months. And what was really disgraceful is that the way that Keir Starmer reacted when he was asked about this at a press conference in early January, instead of saying this is a really serious issue, we're going to get to the bottom of it, instead he smeared people like me as jumping on a, quotes, far-right bandwagon. And subsequently, another senior Labour politician, the leader of the House of Commons, no less, said that it was a dog whistle, quotes, even to raise this issue. So that, frankly, is disgraceful. I'm going to be asking Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary in Parliament, to apologise today for what her colleagues have been saying on this issue, and, of course, trying to make sure that this inquiry they've now finally agreed to, under pressure, is actually going to have the right powers and get to the bottom of it. Because let's be clear, the Labour government haven't done this because they think it's the right thing. They've done it because they've been forced to, partly by Baroness Casey's report. And we also had scheduled on Wednesday, just 2 days' time, a vote in Parliament specifically on this issue. And what prompted them to rush the Casey report out and execute this U-turn over the weekend was the fact we had a vote coming on Wednesday, and that is what has forced them into doing this. They didn't do it voluntarily. Okay. They've been forced to do it.
Yeah, except Baroness Casey's report, her rapid review, was commissioned by this government and has come up with the recommendation that a national inquiry is held. So she believes it's the right thing to do, and the government have accepted that it is the right thing to do. I wonder, as part of that inquiry, I mean, this morning you've made a very serious accusation about West Yorkshire Police. We haven't yet been able to get a response from them. But I wonder what you want this inquiry to investigate. Because you are, obviously there is the issue of who was grooming and abusing these girls, why they weren't looked after properly and listened to. But clearly there are other things that you want this inquiry to address, including, presumably, whether they were deliberately not listened to and there was a cover-up of the abuse, and for what reasons that was done.
Yeah, I'm afraid in all the evidence I've seen, particularly in the last few months, and all the survivors and victims I've spoken to, I'm afraid I think it is the second of those things. It wasn't simply just sort of carelessness. It wasn't even negligence that led to these crimes being ignored. It was actually deliberate. It was intentional. People in authority, both local councils and the police, deliberately decided they didn't want to look at this issue because they thought it would inflame racial tensions, because most of the perpetrators were Pakistani origin and most of the victims were very young white girls, often from troubled backgrounds, often in care homes. And I've spoken, the police officer I mentioned earlier, the retired police officer, Detective Chief Inspector John Pecos, explained, I've given the example in Bradford already. There was actually an earlier example in Oldham that he was involved in when he was serving in the Greater Manchester Police Force, where both a senior police officer in the chain of command and the local authority essentially shut down or discouraged him, actively discouraged him from pursuing investigations into this topic. We saw a case in, I think it was Rochdale, where there were 7 perpetrators convicted just last week of Pakistani origin for offences committed between 2001 and 2006. And social services in that town branded one of the victims, who was a 10-year-old girl. A 10-year-old girl. They described her as a prostitute. I mean, how can a 10-year-old girl be described in that way when she is a victim of gang rape? That is the sort of... and there was another case I came across where there was DNA evidence of, from underwear, of, again, a young girl of that sort of age, 10 or 11 years old, being raped. And the CPS, I think in that case, designated her as a co-conspirator. There was another case where a father went to try and rescue his daughter from being abused in a flat by, again, taxi drivers of Pakistani origin, and the police turned up, and instead of arresting the men who were raping his daughter, they arrested the father. I mean, this is absolutely extraordinary. I cannot believe what I've heard in these last few months about the way the authorities deliberately, not accidentally, deliberately, knowingly covered up these crimes, and not a single person, not even one, has been prosecuted for the offence of misconduct in public office or held to account.
We hope that will change.
And that is why we need the inquiry.
We hope that will change. I mean, from what you're saying, and this has been a widespread comment as well, we're not just talking about fears of being accused of racism. There was a solid dose of misogyny going on, wasn't there, here, and a kind of ghastly cultural snobbery. As you say, these girls, many of them came from difficult, deprived, troubled backgrounds. They were girls, they were women, young women, and there's a strong sense, isn't there, of a kind of a horrible judgmentalism going on, them being written off, basically.
Yeah, they were treated with contempt because often they were young girls in care, and they weren't, but they were just ignored, and they were blamed. Some of these girls were effectively blamed by the police for being somehow complicit in these crimes. I mean, when a girl of like 10, 11, 12 years old is getting raped, I mean, she is a victim, and there is no possible set of considerations that point in any other direction. Yet often they were treated, as I say, somehow as to a complicit or somehow to blame. I mean, it really is, just one of the most shocking things. I've been an MP for 10 years now, and this is probably the most shocking thing I've come across. And I've just heard directly in the last few months from many often now women, but at the time 10 or 20 years ago, girls who have experienced this firsthand. And it really is appalling. And I've heard people giving testimony, this retired Detective Chief Inspector, who said it was explicit. They said he was told by senior officers, we don't want to inflame racial tensions, so just drop it, just ignore it.
Can I just,
that's just the most shocking thing I've heard, frankly.
It is, and I want to just acknowledge that, there's a lot of survivors of this sort of abuse, and many of them will be watching, and I just think we need to, at every stage, just support them and acknowledge them. That's the first thing I want to say. And we're going to speak to 2 survivors after 8 o'clock. I just want to ask you specifically, you say most of this abuse is caused by or perpetrated by men of Pakistani origin. The figures that I have seen show that most of this child sexual abuse is actually committed by white perpetrators, but there is a disproportionate amount of abuse of this type committed by men of Pakistani origin. Are you taking issue with that statistic when you say most is caused by men of Pakistani origin? I just think we need to be careful with the terms here as well.
So you might be referring to some police data from 2024, which shows that while Pakistani origin men are disproportionate, I think about 6 times more likely to be perpetrators. But that is very recent data. I've looked at an academic study by academics from the universities of, I think it was Sussex or Chichester and Reading, who looked at hundreds of offences, group-based sex offences, child sex offences between 1997 and 2017, so a 20-year period covering the time when most of this was going on. This was mostly going on between the late 1990s and the early 2010s. And in that 20-year period, they found that 83% of the perpetrators charged with group-based child sex offences were of 83% were of Muslim background, and the vast majority of those of Pakistani background. So it was 83% across that 20-year period. So those are the figures I'm referring to, and I think that is more representative of the issue than those 2024 police figures, which really come after this scandal happened.
OK, Chris Philp, thank you very much for your time this morning. Susanna and I have two statements to read out. You might want to hear them, actually. The first is from West Yorkshire Police. They gave this statement in April 2024. Quote, since the publication of the J report in 2014, West Yorkshire Police has taken a proactive stance in exploring previous incidents and disclosures relating to non-recent child sex exploitation and abuse. They say the work had been underway for a decade. Hundreds of perpetrators were now in prison. There were trials scheduled for this year and next year. They say they're working with survivors, with national programmes to review their approach, and they say that the survivors are at the forefront of everything they do, and they are protecting children as their primary focus.
A Greater Manchester Police spokesman said, we're determined to ensure survivors can have faith in Greater Manchester Police of today to bring offenders to justice. Bringing child abusers to justice is why our investigation teams work so tirelessly, day in, day out, to piece together all the evidence to present the best possible case in court. Chris Philp.
Can I come back quickly on that?
Yeah, of course,
Just very quickly. So even as recently as this year and last year, Bradford City Council, where some of the worst abuse occurred, has been refusing to cooperate with an inquiry of any kind at all. And then secondly, Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, to his great credit, tried to set up a local inquiry into this, covering the 10 boroughs in Greater Manchester. And the two chairs of that inquiry had to resign last year because they found that even as recently as last year, people in public authorities were covering up evidence and refusing to disclose it to the Greater Manchester local inquiry. So you get these sort of quite complacent statements like the ones you've read out, saying, oh, we're doing X, Y and Z. But the fact is, whether it's Bradford City Council refusing to cooperate with an inquiry or public authorities in Greater Manchester not disclosing information, all of this happened in the last year. This is why we need this proper inquiry, because people are still, even today, trying to cover this up.
Well, we'll go to Bradford Council and see if we can get a response to them from what you just said.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, that's quite the litany of accusations.
It is. I mean, and of course, he
was the policing minister.
Was, but
what did he do? If there had been all this terrible behaviour by police officers, what did he do? He was policing minister. Why has he discovered this now, if that is the case? Now, the truth is, these were horrific, grotesque, unforgivable crimes. And young girls and young women were absolutely failed by the police, local authorities, social services, elected councillors.
Well, we did kind of put that point to him, didn't we, in the second question? And his response was, well, we did commission an inquiry.
And national politicians. When Theresa May set up the Alexis Jay National Inquiry, which the last government didn't implement,
in full, no.
It didn't.
But she did. You know, when he was part of that party that was part of government, his argument is they did do extensive work, including commissioning that inquiry.
Can you remember what Boris Johnson, his colleague, the Prime Minister he supported, said about it? He said it was spaffing money up the wall. That's what he said when these historic cases were being investigated. Hopefully, if we have an inquiry, we will get the real stats. I'd like to see them, because the last Home Office study I saw said most group sex, child exploitation offenders are commonly white, but it is in parts of the country that Pakistani men are overrepresented as a proportion.
The point I meant,
so there's a difference.
The trouble is, Chris Philp then has a different statistic from an academic
because Humza Yousaf, the former First Minister of Scotland, raised the case of a grooming gang that was white. He said it got no publicity when every Pakistani group does.
Can I just say on this? Why I'm glad we're having a national inquiry, because the view had been that local councils could do their own inquiries. It wouldn't have worked, because you've just heard there from Andy Burnham, Greater Manchester, trying to do an inquiry. Resistance within local council. You've got to have somebody from outside looking in. And I make the point, not a single public official has been held to account for the shameful failure of these women who often came from broken homes. This is what happened with Jimmy Savile. He was abusing and raping young girls. They were often from broken homes, and nobody paid any attention. The same pattern of behaviour, those girls let down by the system.
There was misogyny involved, as you said,
Absolutely.
Richard. But I read the first Alexis J report into Rotherham. I read it beginning to end, and you could see class was an issue because these girls were from working class homes, troubled families. They weren't given the attention. If they'd been the daughters of journalists or lawyers or doctors, I've no doubt the police and the local authorities would have swung into action.
There was going to be a vote on Wednesday, and Labour was all poised to vote against a national inquiry. So we've got the Casey review coming out today, earlier than expected, because what was Labour going to do? Were they going to vote against that inquiry on Wednesday? They were going to.
There was a previous vote. It's nothing to do with those votes.
Can I just say, for survivors of this kind of sexual abuse, they don't care about the politics.
They need the inquiry.
We need to find out the facts.
And who let them down? Who let them down?
We've got accusations and counter-accusations. Exactly. And what did you do? Now we are going to have the inquiry. Just wanted to say Bradford City Council said arrests and prosecutions for historic child sexual exploitation offences continue to be made in the district, and it will not flinch in bringing perpetrators to justice.
Can I just say you're right about get the facts. You're right about support for these people, so who lost their childhoods, and some of their adulthoods. But also, possibly the more significant in the last 6 months, as the Home Secretary has got the National Crime Agency to go back to cold cases, and 800 have been reactivated, where now they were shut and no one was brought to justice.
Right.
There are still docks and prison cells awaiting those who committed these horrific crimes.
And let's hope they're filled soon. All right, we've only got 4 minutes left before we go to the news and the weather. Let's just quickly talk about what's happening between Iran and Israel. Am I right? Do you sense a shift? A few days ago, when Israel launched its strikes on the nuclear facilities, there was generally, certainly in this country, a backlash against it. There seems to be a shift in the mood. There does seem to be more support now, if you look certainly at social media and at the more conventional media, that actually Israel is doing something which it really doesn't have much choice not to do. What's your sense?
Israel struck when Iran's proxies, allies, are at their weakest. The talk is that Iran is getting closer and closer to enriching, getting close to
uranium,
to having a position where going nuclear power. Iran's whole raison d'etre is to wipe Israel off the map.
No, it's not. It's not. It's not. It's a terrible regime. That's a threat.
It is run by and they want to destroy Iran, and they've got and their allies are Hamas and Syria.
They want to destroy Israel.
They want to destroy Israel. They want to destroy Israel. And Israel has struck first.
Netanyahu is itched to launch this attack for years, arguably decades. Other US presidents held him back. Because do we want Iran to get nuclear weapons, become the 10th country joining the UK and Israel with nuclear weapons? No, we don't. Bit of hypocrisy in that, but we don't want them to get it. But how do you do it? He has scuppered talks that had a reasonable prospect.
Those talks have never worked.
And also, we just had the international... hang on, Kevin. The International Atomic Energy Authority has, for the first time in 20 years, been blocked by Iran because they've got much closer. So they have been doing it under the stealth, and so that's why Israel's had to strike. They can't trust the mullahs.
There was an effective international agreement signed by Joe Biden. The UK was part of it. Other countries were part of it, holding Iran back, and Donald Trump pulled it.
What do you make of the fact that American officials have said that Donald Trump vetoed their plan, an Israeli plan, to kill the supreme leader of Iran? I mean, what if Israel had managed to kill Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, what would the consequences of that have been?
All-out war.
So it looks like the American officials have said we do have the sort of guiding hand on what Israel are doing.
Clearly they do. And look, this is a war I do not think the UK should get pulled into. There's too much of the old Iraq around it again. Including the warnings in advance. But, of course, Trump survived an assassination attempt himself. So I suspect he probably thinks it's unwise to assassinate
What do you think of those who say that what Israel is doing is actually doing the West generally a favour? I think they're doing our dirty work for us.
I think Iran is an unstable, dangerous nation on the brink of getting nuclear power, and it's got to be stopped at all costs.
No, that's what Israel's doing. There's no favour. I've got to stop Iran, but this is not the way to stop Iran.
Well, they've tried negotiating, Kevin. It's got nowhere.
There was a deal. They did get somewhere until Trump pulled it.
Wrong.
OK, well, we've got a G7 summit
You're wrong.
going on. Everybody wants it to de-escalate, I can imagine. It's very nerve-wracking.
Cheers.
Can I, just before we let you go, have you seen the new £10 million door at the House of Lords?
We've both heard about it.
Which does not work. It was designed to help make the House of Lords more secure. The bill has ballooned to £9.6 million. The project was approved back in March 2022. It was expected to cost £6 million even then.
For a door.
I know.
Peers have
It is a big
described
door.
it as a complete white elephant and a disaster. It doesn't open
work.
properly. It needs a member of staff to press a button to let you in.
How secure is that?
It doesn't work.
I use 2 doors to the right of it, which work perfectly well. I do not know why
the
we have
state
spent
at its
£10 million
best.
on
No,
a
that's
door
right.
that does not work.
We can't do anything on
9.6
time.
million, not just on a door, but a door
That doesn't
won't work.
Can you imagine the size of a
Humiliating.
house you could get if you...
Humiliating.
spent
It's
it?
We laugh,
humiliating.
but it's what a waste.
No,
What a waste.
Parliament can't
What a
get their
waste.
own house in order.
They literally can't get their own house in order.